Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 2 of Urban Legends and Mythology, your home for all things dark, macabre, and mysterious. So without further ado, let's get into the topic of the day. We are discussing Atlantis. So let's just start with the simple basic question, what was Atlantis? Well, Atlantis was literally a continent, a lost continent. It existed up until 10,000 years ago. It had this hyper-advanced society that lived on it. It was abundant in wealth and luxury. Its people became corrupted. It wanted to go out and conquer other lands. However, it lost this integral war against Athens, and that led to its downfall. Their greed and their lust for power and their lust for rule over all men led to a series of cataclysms brought to you by the Greek gods themselves, which sank the entire continent underneath the Atlantic Ocean. Its story becomes an allegorical tale of the dangers of hubris and the dangers of greed, and in recent times it has become a trope in fiction. It's like a placeholder for any underwater lost civilization. I mean, it's literally the first thing we think of when we hear the words underwater city, and that's the story, right? That's the basic story we all know. But is there any truth behind that story? Where did this legend come from? Why did Plato write about it? And does it, or remnants of it, and its peoples actually exist? Well, in order to answer those questions, we have to dive in right at the beginning. So 10,000 BC. Let's ask ourselves what's going on in the world around 10,000 BC. Well, it's around this time when humans are just starting to domesticate goats. We're all still a bunch of primitive tribes who were like banging rocks together and living either a hunter-gatherer or a sedentary lifestyle depending on where you're at on the planet. We're still learning how to ferment grapes and other stuff in order to make alcohol. And according to Plato, there is a giant continent out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with hyper-advanced technology who wants to reign over the world. Also, according to Plato at this time, Athens exists, which is kind of funny because archaeologically speaking, nobody would even inhabit the area around Athens for at least the next 7,000 years, but I digress. But this isn't Plato's Athens of 380 BC. No, that's not good enough. This is like his girly fanfic version of the idealized Athens. So Plato's ancient version of this pure Athens is a place where the Athenians were pure and virtuous and eschewed luxury in favor of a literal Spartan lifestyle of militant training and no personal belongings. So it's like this idealized version of Athens with a Spartan political and military structure just because Plato thought Spartan was cool. However, it's also fairly egalitarian. I mean, unlike Athens in his own time, he actually describes this version of Athens with women being equal to men, so that's pretty cool. But essentially the point he's getting across when he discusses his idealized version of this ancient Athens is it was a place of piety, of lack of greed, lack of want. It was a very virtuous society with a very badass military. And Atlantis by this time has become the opposite of that, the polar opposite of that. It is a place where man has become corrupted with greed and power, and they seek out to conquer the world and are defeated. So in this narrative, Athens good, Atlantis bad. But again, I'm jumping around a lot, so let's try to create some kind of cohesive timeline here. I'm gonna start with the timeline of Atlantis, which runs all the way through Plato's writings. Then I'm gonna jump into Plato, and then I'm gonna jump into the modern day. So the story literally starts with the Greek god Poseidon. Now, Poseidon was the brother of Zeus and Hades, and the Greek gods get into this battle with the Titans and the giants, and they win. And after this battle, their father Kronos decides to split the world amongst these three. So Zeus gets the sky and the heavens, Hades, he gets the underworld and darkness, and Poseidon gets the sea. And with the sea comes the continent of Atlantis. And this was actually a very very vast continent, and it was abundant in resources, and everything the Atlanteans could ever want would be provided there on this continent. So on the continent, there's this chick named Plato, and in Greek, this word literally means illustrious or magnificent. So Poseidon falls in love with Plato and marries her, and he goes on to create this island for her and these like circular rings of land and water around her home. And Plato goes on to bear Poseidon 5 sets of twins, so he had 10 sons. Now with Plato being mortal, these sons were all considered half gods. This becomes important later in the story, but the eldest one of these sons was Atlas. And if you're familiar with your Greek mythology, we all know who Atlas is, and if you're not familiar with the mythology, just look it up. Wikipedia is like a click away. Anyways, so Atlas is the first of these sons, and this is where the name Atlantis comes from. It's named for him, and it goes on to be the name of the ocean in which they reside, Atlantis. So time goes on, and Poseidon decides that he's going to divide this continent amongst his 10 sons. Atlas, being the eldest, would be the king of all of them, and would be granted the like big center plane of the island, which not only was where his mother's house was located, but it was the richest and most fertile, and it was just like the best piece of land. And the rest of the brothers would be given their own portions of land as well, and they all would all rule as like princes under this new king. And this was said to kick off the golden age of Atlantis. It was a time of abundance, a time of wealth, and the continent provided everything for the Atlanteans. It sprouted every kind of fruit and vegetable you can think of. There was all kinds of animals that lived there. Hell, even elephants are mentioned as living there, probably because Plato thought elephants were cool. But it said that this is a time when they were living in luxury and abundance, and their technology was getting extremely advanced. They were like harnessing quartz and some kind of resonance and frequencies in order to heal the human body and to create light for everyone, so electricity. And even due to the favorable climate and this advanced technology now, they could actually harvest twice a year. So there was always an abundance of food to go around. To be honest, it really reads like a commie hippie utopia at this point. They had cities of ivory and gold and orichalcum, and orichalcum is just some kind of metal that Plato made up. It was said to be like this rare earth metal, which was like copper, but it was almost as valuable as gold. It was basically a MacGuffin that you can just make do whatever you want. But the Atlanteans had it, and it helped them develop this highly advanced society. So we're at a point right now where everything's good, right? You know, the place basically looks like Asgard from the Thor movies. So everything's going good. What happens? Where does all go wrong? Well, remember when I said that the children were half gods? Well, Plato spends a great deal of time talking about the lineage of these families that were all descended from Poseidon and Plato. So the first sons were half gods, the next sons were quarter gods, and so on, until you get down to that guy who's like, yeah, I'm like 1/64th of a god. And it's like, so basically you're a human? Yeah, basically he's a human. And that's kind of what happens in the story. The more human they become, the more corruptible they become, the more greedy they become, the more power hungry you become, and the more warlike you become. So even though Atlantis provided them with everything they could ever possibly want and need, they wanted more, so they started conquering other lands. And they fought and conquered their way across the Mediterranean until they came to Athens, the old 10,000 BC Athens. You remember Plato's wet dream of Athenian culture. And despite being technologically advanced or whatever, they were so corrupted that they were defeated and they were sent back to Atlantis with their tails between their legs. And after this war, the gods, they decide to interfere, and they're like, we need to do something to teach the Atlanteans a lesson. And to be honest, that's kind of where the manuscript ends. We don't have the end of it. But what we've been able to kind of infer from the context of it all, the gods send a series of cataclysms to rock Atlantis. And the final cataclysm is the swallowing up of the whole continent by the ocean. And it's said that the city of Atlantis resides on the ocean floor to this very day, just waiting for someone to discover it. Now, a lot of people allege that a lot of the Atlanteans were able to escape and they made their way to like South America and Egypt and Mesopotamia and India, and they go on to say that they were the true ancestors of all those cultures. However, there is a vast amount of archaeological evidence all over the world that clearly disputes disputes that. So I'm not going to go into it here because I personally believe that it's all garbage. I mean, if you believe that, you're literally discounting the idea that humans are smart enough to stack rocks on top of each other. And if you truly believe that ancient humans were so stupid that they literally had to have a hyper-advanced civilization teach them how to stack rocks on top of each other in order to thrive and become civilized, then reach out to me because I have some oceanfront property in New Mexico I think you might be interested in. Sadly, I don't think the younger generations will understand that reference. But I digress, so that basically brings us to the end of the Atlantean story, the Atlantean myth. And to be honest, it gets really elaborate and detailed. I just glossed over it, but if you want to read it, you're welcome to read it. I mean, the two dialogues that the story comes from are the Timaeus and the Critias. And speaking of those dialogues, let's really get into Plato and into why he wrote this and where he got the story from, because that is critically important to this whole thing. So we'll just start. Who the hell was Plato? What was he all about? So put simply, Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher born in Athens during the Athenian classical period. He was born around 424 or 423 BC. He lived until 348 BC. Now, Plato's actual name was Aristoteles. Plato was a nickname given to him due to his girth. It was actually given to him by his wrestling coach. Now, Plato, he was an innovator when it came to written dialogue and dialectic philosophy. He was a student of Socrates and a teacher to Aristotle. He founded what was essentially the first, I guess you could call it an academy, or what we would say today, university of philosophy. And he really loved to theorize and write about civilizations and countries and politics. You know, he liked to do thought experiments about the ideal perfect country or the ideal perfect government, and he would write these down. Plato's Republic is probably one of his most famous works on this. Now, to be honest, I'm just generalizing on the man here based on this particular topic. Let's just say the guy was extremely influential when it came to philosophical thought and thought experiments during this time. However, personally, I think the guy's got nothing on my personal favorite, Diogenes of Sinope, but I digress. So let's kind of get into where the idea of creating Atlantis formulated. So it all kind of starts while Plato and these other guys, Timaeus and Critias, and I think Socrates was there too, we're all just kind of riffing on the idea of the perfect society, e.g. Plato's Republic, e.g. that Athenian wet dream he has about the perfect Athens. And the account of this riffing is essentially written down in these two dialogues. So the Timaeus begins with an introduction, followed by an account of the creations and structures of the universe. And in the introduction, Socrates is musing about the perfect society as described in Plato's Republic. And old Socrates goes on to wonder if any of his guests might recollect a story which exemplifies such a society. And I hope anybody who understood that little joke is having an excellent time. So Critias, he's there, and he mentions a tale that he considered to be a historical narrative that would make the perfect example. And then he follows this up by describing Atlantis. And Critias, he claims that he heard this tale from like his great-great-grandfather or whatever, who heard the tale from like Solon, who visited Egypt between 590 and 580 BC. So it's basically like, this is a tale that my great-great-granddaddy heard from some guy who was already ancient in his great-great-granddaddy's times, who apparently heard it from an old Egyptian priest. However, there's no actual written accounts or evidence ever produced from that old Egyptian priest or this old great-great-granddaddy or whatever. But he heard it, so he knows it's true. Kind of like the origin of every urban legend ever. It's always like a friend of a friend whose grandfather's friend heard this or experienced this. It's totally not like my stories, which are actually true, like the time I met Bigfoot, or the time I met the jackalope, or the time I met the skunk ape, or that time I went cow tipping. But I'm a little off topic now, so let's go to the Critias, where he actually describes Atlantis. So in the Critias, they're describing Atlantis, and they're kind of juxtaposing it to the ideal version of Athens. And it kind of starts out with Atlantis being this perfect society, kind of like Plato's fanfic of Athens. But then over time, as it becomes more human-like, it devolves into a wretched society that has to be wiped off the face of the earth. And it all becomes this wonderful thought exercise of what is the perfect society, can the perfect society exist, blah blah blah, we all know the rest. And for the next 1800 or so years, that's where it remains. It remains a thought exercise, a speculation. Plato always made up random societies in these thought experiments, but at some point around the 16 or 1700s, people started thinking that this allegory was mentioning a real physical place because of what happens during that time. During that time, we discover the Americas. And then some people who are scholars, they start to think, well, Plato mentioned this continent out in the Atlantic, and we just found two continents out in the Atlantic. Could this be Atlantis? And this kind of kicks off that quest, that idea that, maybe he was actually talking about a real place. And this becomes especially popular when we notice that, hey, there are advanced civilizations living in Central and South America. Essentially cultures that we attacked and conquered, the Aztec, the Inca, the Maya, along with their ancestor cultures, the Toltec and the Olmec and all those other cultures in South Central America. And even here in North America, we had like the Adena culture. They were a culture of mound builders, and the remnants of like the Mississippian culture who created things like Fort Ancient and Cahokia. And all these contemporary minds in like the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century started believing that these people were possibly descendants from Atlantis, and it really gets tied in with Mayanism. And it really starts this 19th century revival in the idea of Atlantis and the search for Atlantis. However, it becomes a city or a continent that eludes us to this very day. So kind of this modern day revival really starts with this guy named Donnelly, and in 1882 he writes Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And in this book, he essentially proposes that places like the Garden of Eden and Atlantis were wiped out by the Great Flood of biblical times, which, to be honest, would roughly relate to about 10 to 12,000 years ago when the glaciers were melting and sea levels were rising. But he's just really basing this all on his own conjecture. However, he becomes like the father of the modern Atlantean movement, and this actually leads to his writings being taken up by a lady named Helena Blavatsky, who was the founder of the Theosophists, who were a very influential group of religious occultists. They were really into things like seances and esotericism and spiritualism and all these Eastern practices which were coming out of like India, and they were actually loosely connected to Rasputin, who I discussed in extensive detail last season, so go check that episode out. And she kind of takes Donnelly's interpretations and incorporates it into her own writing, The Secret Doctrine, in 1888. However, she does put her own spin on it. She maintains that the Atlanteans were cultural heroes, contrary to Plato, who describes them as a military threat. She also backdates the civilization to between 1 million and 900,000 years ago, and she maintains that they destroyed themselves through internal warfare brought on by the dangerous use of psychic and supernatural powers. However, she does get kind of racist during the whole thing. In her process of evolution, the Atlanteans were the fourth, quote, root race, end quote, which were succeeded by the fifth, quote, Aryan race, which she identifies with the modern human race. And she goes on to mention that the Atlanteans were olive-skinned peoples with Mongoloid traits who were the ancestors of modern Native Americans, Mongolians, and Malayans. However, that idea then gets picked up by these German guys who believe that the Atlanteans were Nordic supermen who originated in the northern Atlantic, and that idea in around 1900 gets picked up by the German Thule Society, and it eventually evolves into that Aryan master race bullshit. And then Atlantis and the search for Atlantis and all this stuff gets tied up with all that weird Nazi archaeology and anthropology as they're traveling through the Near East trying to find the origins of this so-called master race, this Aryan race. However, it was also around the same time in the 1930s when the idea of Atlantis was becoming popular again. And one of the men who actually popularized it was a man named Edgar Cayce. Now, Edgar Cayce, he was a man from Kentucky, and he was like a clairvoyant or a psychic or something like that. And during his kind of trances or readings or whatever you want to call them, he would frequently talk about Atlantis. And he would claim that many of the people he was doing the readings for were actually reincarnations of people from Atlantis. And during these readings in around 1938, he gives his accounts that Atlantis would rise again in the 1960s, and part of it would be discovered in the 1960s. And he actually gave the location. He said the location would be found in the Bahamas in an area around Bimini. And it just so happens that in 1968, divers off the Bimini coast found the infamous Bimini Road, which many people believe to be a man-made structure. Now, to be honest, most geologists say that it's just beach rock that fractured weird and it looks like a wall or a road. And I'm kind of in that same camp because I'm just kind of skeptical. However, when you do look at footage of the Bimini Road, and you can find it anywhere online, just Google it, those fractures look a little too straight for something that is made by nature. And a quick side note, this is just kind of one of the general rules of archaeology, and it's if you're ever looking for a man-made site, pretty much anywhere in the world, look for straight lines, because if you find straight lines, you're most likely finding a site that was impacted by humans. Humans create straight lines, nature almost never does. Now, to be honest, a lot of people don't know what the Bimini Road is. Personally, I think it's beach rock, but it could be shaped beach rock, we don't know. Now, Edgar Cayce also did say that at some point that a hall of records would be found beneath the Sphinx, and this would hold the historical texts of Atlantis. So far as we know, there's never been a hall of records found beneath the Sphinx. However, that is a popular myth, and I will probably get into that in a future episode. And speaking of future episodes, I'm also planning on doing a biography on Edgar Cayce because he was a fascinating man when it comes to the occult, the clairvoyant, etc., etc. So look out for that episode. However, since it became popular again in the mindset, there have been dozens of places which have been speculated to be the lost city of Atlantis. Now, a lot of them have been in and around the Mediterranean Sea because we had the island of Santorini, the island of Crete, which was the home of the Minoans, and other various little islands that were volcanic that experienced disasters, and portions of those islands sank into the sea and those cultures are gone. And a lot of people believe that these islands were an influence on that destruction part when it comes to Plato. Describes the destruction of the island at the end. He says it was brought down by volcanoes and the waves, and it blew up essentially and sunk into the sea. And they can be like, contemporaries at the time can be like, oh, you mean like Crete or like Santorini? And Plato could have been like, yeah, just like those places. And other people have proposed sites pretty much all over the Atlantic Ocean. I've heard people say that it's in the Caribbean. People have said it's up in Iceland. Some people said it's covered by Greenland's ice sheets. Some people have even said it's Oak Island, which I don't really get. Oak Island is tiny. And other people have even proposed that Atlantis was Troy, which I really don't get because we found Troy and it's on dry land. And we literally know it was destroyed by war and fire, so I don't get that one. And other people have even proposed that it's under the ice of Antarctica and we just haven't found it yet. But me, I'm kind of grounded in that camp where I believe it was just Plato's fan fiction. I don't believe that Atlantis actually existed. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm like a Debbie Downer with the whole thing. There are fascinating underwater cities out there. And yes, I am going to end this episode talking about our oceans because, as we know, more than 70% of our Earth is covered in ocean. And under those oceans and seas, there are underwater cities. The Egyptian city of Heraclium is a prime example of an underwater city. Now, Heraclium didn't sink in a catastrophic single event. It was a series of earthquakes and liquefaction, which is a geologic process, which gradually sank Heraclium. But it's almost perfectly preserved, and it's exactly what you think of when you think of an underwater city. It's just like that image of Atlantis you have in your mind right now. Port Royal off the coast of Jamaica, a massive earthquake hit Port Royal in 1692 and sank like most of the city. And with that being this awesome pirate haven at the time, you could potentially find pirate treasure at Port Royal. And there's the infamous Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan. A lot of people believe that that was man-made, and that kind of goes back to the idea of Bimini Road because there's these straight lines that just look like they were created by human intervention as opposed to nature. And there are possibly countless more. But I think the fact that Atlantis may lay underwater kind of alludes to that like little itch we all have to like find an ancient underwater city. Just like with El Dorado, we hope to just be walking in the jungles of South America one day and just stumble upon a lost city of gold. It's that inherent curiosity that kind of keeps us glued to that myth. And who knows, I could be completely wrong. I don't know, I wasn't there. There could be a lost city that was once called Atlantis somewhere under the waves off the coasts of Europe or Africa or North America, we don't know. But my favorite two sunken areas in the world that I would personally really love to explore are the Bering Strait, where Beringia once was, and Doggerland, which was this low-lying area in the North Sea that existed when our sea levels were much lower. And if you want to know where Doggerland is, it's essentially the British Isles over towards like heading towards like Sweden and Denmark. So back during the last ice age when sea levels were much lower, that whole area was kind of connected, and it was this huge area where like, you know, early humans were like hanging out and living their whole lives. And it's the same with Beringia. People think Beringia was just a land bridge, but no, it was this huge area and people were actually living in this area. And these areas were these people's homes for multiple generations. However, during the end of the last glacial maximum, 12,000 years ago roughly, you know, the sea levels rise and naturally they sank beneath the waves. And especially in Doggerland, every time like a fishing trawler goes through or something, they pull up more artifacts. They've pulled up like mammoth bones with butcher marks. They've pulled up tools and harpoons, all from these Stone Age cultures who live there and don't exist anymore. And I guess for me, that's kind of my personal idea of Atlantis. It's more, I guess, archaeological in nature. However, I wouldn't mind diving off the coast of Jamaica in order to find some pirate treasure. That would be friggin' awesome. But in closing, what can I really say about Atlantis? Well, it was really just a mind exercise by Plato and some of his little students or whatever. They were kind of just talking and riffing about, you know, the idea of a perfect society versus an imperfect society. And it remained a minor footnote in Plato's writings for a very long time until the idea was picked up again and thrust into urban legend. But now it's kind of become a trope for this magical underwater city. I mean, a lot of fiction writers use it as a setting. I mean, look at Aquaman. And I guess in a way that's kind of cool how it's kind of evolved into that mythical idea of an underwater city. But as I said, I personally don't believe it exists. But I like to keep my life positive, and I like to think that maybe someday I'll be proven wrong. And on that note, I think that's where I'm going to end it for this episode. Once again, this is Mike. I do thank you for listening. And if you like the show, if you like what I'm doing here, I just ask that you just spread the word, share my links, follow it on Spotify or whatever platform you're on. These episodes now also automatically upload to YouTube shortly after they're uploaded to Spotify. So if you can't find me through one of the traditional podcasting apps, just type Urban Legends and Mythology into YouTube. It'll come right up. As always, if you want to donate, you can always click my link down in the description, the support this podcast link, or you can reach out to me directly. My email is public, and I can give you further instructions on, say, if you want to donate and you don't want to use that link, or if you want to send me something in the mail like so many of you have already done. Or hell, if you just want to offer some constructive criticism, go to the YouTube page and offer that constructive criticism there. That's probably where I'll most likely see it. And I know I sound like a broken record at the end of these things when I'm saying this stuff, but everything, all that support, it really truly does help out the show, and it keeps me motivated to keep making more of these. So as always, once again, thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.